Are we live? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Janis Ware, and I'm the publisher of the Atlanta Voice newspaper. I also serve on both the boards of the Nnpa, the foundation, and the association board. I would like to welcome our attendees for this Black Press virtual experience. The Black Press has chronicled the history of African Americans for more than 194 years. Yet we still struggle to receive the advertising or sponsorship dollars required to remain viable business entities. Consequently, we're looking for alternative funding sources to fill that gap, which is the title of this panel, Alternative Funding Sources for the Black Press. My panelists today are Trusty with the Democracy Fund, where she leads their grant portfolio centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion in journalism. Vincent Stehle, who is the executive director of Media Impact Funders, a membership organization of foundation officials and philanthropists who support media and technology in the public interest. And finally, LaSharah Bunting, who is the director of journalism at the Knight Foundation, where she manages a portfolio focused on advancing transformation and diversity in journalism. Let us thank our panels, and I appreciate you agreeing to be with us today. I would also like the participants of the audience to know that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box so that we can actually address those questions as well. I would like to begin by asking each of you to tell us briefly about what you do at your organization and a little bit about the history of the organization. We're going to start with LaSharah.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So I am Director of Journalism at Knight Foundation. Knight Foundation focuses on a couple of different areas, communities and national initiatives. We have a collection of 24 Knight communities around the country that we invest in deeply. Arts, and then journalism. The Knight brothers, if you think of Knight Ridder and the long, beautiful history of that organization, that is where Knight Foundation comes in the funding. And so I consider journalism sort of the flagship part of the foundation. So as director of journalism there, I've been there about 3.5 years. So I'm focused on a couple of different areas. The top one being transformation, right? What are the things that need to happen at news organizations and across the journalism ecosystem to shift news organizations from sort of where they were, largely print focused in many situations, to fully digital entities and to be thinking about their sustainability long term. So some people watching might be familiar with the Table Stakes initiative, which is a multi-million-dollar initiative that we have out in the marketplace that Knight funds as a way to really push news organizations to that path to sustainability. So that is really a big, big part of the work that I do. Also part of that is equity and diversity and inclusion in journalism. I mean, we all know that is, when I think about journalism and the issues that exist, to me, we talk about the local news crisis, which is something that Knight Foundation really is quite focused on. But to me, equity is another crisis in journalism. And we have to be thinking about what are the ways that we can bring systemic change. In that way, there's no other thing outside, to me, in my opinion, outside of the local news, the decline of local news. There's no other thing besides equity and diversity that is as important. And also, I'm focused a lot on journalism education. That is the bulk of Knight Foundation's legacy work. So we're talking endowments that go back a few decades, endowments that existed, universities and endowed Knight chairs. And we see that as an opportunity to sort of influence and impact the next generation of journalists. The one thing I'll leave with, and just want to add, just from a broader view for Knight, our focus and our priority is around local news sustainability, and what are the levers and what are the things that we can support and invest in that will help the ecosystem broadly. So that is really what our strategic focus is as a whole team.
Great. Leah?
Thank you, Janis, and great to be with everyone here today on this Friday afternoon or morning, depending on where you're at. So my name is Leah Trusty. I'm a program associate at Democracy Fund. Like Janis said, working primarily on our diversity, equity, and inclusion and grants focused on journalism. So Democracy Fund is definitely one of the newer foundations in this space. I want to say we're a little over 6 years old now. Although we existed informally in one of our sister organizations. So we were initially founded by Piero Midyar, and really the goal of the foundation overall is to ensure that democracy is centering all communities across the country, serving them in the ways that quite frequently in history, folks have been left out. So we have a couple of different strategies that focus on this work. So we have our governance team, which does a lot of work around constructive politics, modernizing Congress. We have our elections team, which does a lot of fantastic work around building trusted elections processes and modernizing elections as well. So online and automatic voter registration. We have our Just Inclusive Societies work. And then we also have our Public Square team, which is the team that I serve on primarily. So within that team, we have a couple of different strategies. They're all deeply related. So our press freedom work, which deals with a couple of legal clinics across the country in support of newsrooms that are facing legal threats. Our ecosystem news team, which works with regions across the country in places like New Mexico, North Carolina, New Jersey, Colorado, to really leverage the different players in what a news ecosystem is and building on them to ensure sustainability across them. And then we also have our engaged journalism team, which I serve on with my colleague Angelica Das, and that is primarily funding both newsrooms, but also journalism support organizations, some universities. And then, of course, we have our Digital Democracy Initiative, which primarily focuses on liaising with platforms and centering human and civil rights in the policies that either bring folks in online and offline spaces or exclude and marginalize them, and thinking about ways that we can both work with them, but also apply pressure to make it a more inclusive space for everyone. So for the portfolio that I work on, specifically around DEI, I'd say we're working with like 3 specific levers. So the training and promotion of journalists from historically marginalized communities. And we do a lot of that work with our partners like NABJ, AAJA, JAWS, NLGJ, lots of alphabet soup there. And we're very proud to be partnering with all those organizations. And then of course, funding some newsrooms directly. So we'll do a lot of that work through the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, but we also have some grantees in our portfolio like Outlier Media and City Bureau. And then of course, working with organizations that are really driving more equitable and inclusive practices throughout the industry. So we do a lot of work with the Maynard Institute, Open News, just to name a few.
Great. All right, Vince.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Janis. It's a great privilege to be on this panel with such important leaders in our field. The Knight Foundation and Democracy Fund are 2 of our most important members, and LaSharah and Leah have been really clarion voices for the change we need to see in our field. We recognize that particularly for philanthropy, it's a moment of reckoning, and different parts of philanthropy have stepped forward with support for anti-Black racism activities, the movement for Black lives, and other issues. I think that the field of media funding support has a little bit of work to do. There are some initiatives that have been taken, but I think our field still needs to work hard to catch up with the rest of philanthropy in this area. And LaSharah and Lee have been really strong voices in that work. Our organization is Media Impact Funders. We're a membership organization, as you said, Janis, and we've got dozens of members, but we also represent a field that is hundreds of foundations. For sure, the Knight Foundation and Democracy Fund are, two of the leaders in our country, and LaSharah and Leah probably know that everyone on this call already knows who they are, but they're not the only ones who are making these grants. And there are big national funders like Ford and MacArthur foundations that are prominent names that you may know. And certainly, if you listen to NPR or PBS, you see the long litany of names of more familiar names. But wherever you are in the country, there are foundations, maybe private foundations, family foundations, community foundations, who are supporting work in your neighborhood too. And so I think it's important to understand that, if you're seeking a grant, don't just go to the usual suspects of the Knight Foundation and Democracy Fund. They're already working hard, both of them, to stimulate activity at the local level, and that's happening. And I can say that, it's important. I'm happy to share our web address. Hopefully, you're able to see that in the chat log here alongside if they're posting it. We have a map. The most important thing I think I can share with you is that at mediaimpactfunders.org, you can find a data map that we create in partnership with Candid, which is formerly known as the Foundation Center. They're the ones who do all of the data mapping for philanthropy. And you can search on our site for who's funding media geographically, programmatically, and there are thousands of grants listed there. And I'll just post one other thing. Hopefully, it'll connect up through the chat log as well. That a couple of years ago, we did a survey, a study of the data in the map, and found that in journalism funding, there were between 2009 and 2017. There was a huge increase in grant making for journalism. Initially, it was 300 funders making about $70 million in grants to just over 300 recipients. And by about a decade later, there were 1,200 funders making $255 million in grants to 925 organizations. The grants data lags a few years, but you can already see the trajectory is strongly forward. And so that's, I think, important for people to understand that there are a lot more grant makers out there beyond Knight, beyond Democracy Fund, and you can find them at the local level too. I think I'll stop there, but that gives you a sense of the field that we represent.
I'm certain that a lot of publishers are interested in the information that you just delivered, because the fact is, while we are familiar with Ford and the Knight Foundation, a lot of times you are not familiar with these other organizations that are giving out funding. So my question is going to be directed back to you. Will they fund for-profit news organizations, or are they just limited to not-for-profit organizations? And how does that work? Yeah,
it's an important point. And I would say it's a learning process, but the process has started probably 10 years ago now. The Ford Foundation has made grants to the LA Times and the Washington Post about that long ago. There have been a handful of grants that have been floating around for a number of years. More recently, there was an initiative, I think the Democracy Fund, working with the Dodge Foundation in New Jersey, did a lot of regional work where that team found that a lot of the most important community work was happening through for-profit enterprises. And so they worked through the legal requirements to establish that, yes, you can make grants to for-profit entities. That message has sort of echoed throughout the community. And last year, in the response, there was another crisis of COVID, and there was a pretty concerted effort by a lot of funders to respond to the challenges for community media for-profit and not-for-profit. And one example is the Facebook commitments, which was many millions of dollars were flowing equally, I think, through the local media association to for-profit enterprises. So all that's to say that there's a lot of experience now. And so even while a particular funder may not be familiar with or not aware of the ability to, your news organization can help educate them and say, you probably can do this. Here are several places where you can look to give you guidance. And we're, of course, happy to provide some of that guidance too, if people want to contact us. And for the funder who wants to feel comfortable doing that, we can help them understand that, yes, you can. And I'll just say, because it's today, that Facebook has an initiative which I think has a deadline of today, which is the Facebook Journalism Project Accelerator Programs. Mm-hmm. Is everybody familiar with that? Because it happens to be that and they are an organization that will fund for-profit enterprises. So maybe you should shut your computers off and go file that application. But that's my hot tip for the day.
Today is definitely the deadline for that?
Today's the deadline, March 19th.
I don't know if you can put that link in the chat as well. So
I'll try to get that up too. That
would be great. So LaSharah and Leah, can you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing with regards to funds and funding?
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to add is, so from Knight's perspective, some people might be aware of the Knight Media Forum, and that's been around for about 12 years or so. I think we just closed out our session for the year a couple weeks ago, and Leah served on a session that I did about dismantling systemic racism in philanthropy and in journalism. So I'm grateful for that. The whole purpose of Knight Media Forum is really to bring together place-based foundations, small family foundations all across the country to persuade them to invest in news in their communities. And Knight has been doing that work for about 10 plus years, trying to make the case. And over that time, we've seen an increase in community foundations and funders really stepping up, right? Those foundations who had been focused on homelessness or hunger or other, gun violence or other things in their communities really started to understand the impact and importance of funding news and information in their communities as a path to their other goals. And there's tons of guidance written, for those organizations as they're trying to ramp up and figure out how to move forward. So I say that to say that is something that's been happening, in addition to what Vince talked about for years. When it comes to for-profit organizations, here's the thing: it is not a deal breaker, right? You can fund for-profit entities, but you have to understand that there's a certain level of there's certain hurdles and things that you have to go through. And the number one really being, what is the charitable purpose, right? So if we are funding a nonprofit, that's a very easy thing to do. The IRS rules are what they are, and we follow those. When the for-profit entity and the foundation need to talk about what is the charitable purpose? What's the charitable benefit that's going to get out of this, right? Like, are we just funding a for-profit entity as if we're an investor, right? And honestly, you have to. Those are things that really are watched very closely. So even when you're approaching a funder, like a private foundation, you have to think about, like, what is the charitable benefit here, and what are the ways that I can give back to the community through that funding. There are other ways to invest as a foundation into for-profit entities, PRIs. So there are ways to sort of invest outside of the normal grant funding. And I think it's just incumbent on foundations to be more creative, and also for the potential grantee to understand what the options are. And as Vince said, be there to help educate as well.
Great.
Yeah. I'll just, oh, sorry, Janis.
Oh, no, go on.
I'll just add that. So we funded a couple of for-profits. We're definitely more nonprofit, I think, like most foundations, but we've in the past like tacked on additional dollars to really help with some of those complications. So like giving folks like an additional $5,000 or $10,000 for like legal support or for financial support, because often when we're funding a for-profit, an LLC, or whatever shape it takes, you have to keep like entirely separate books in order to track the spending and say that this is separate from the rest of the spending that we use for the organization. So I think that's one practice that, you know, more foundations, and I know several of our peers do as well, but I think that's one practice that could help foundations. And similar to what both LaSharah and Vince said, I think it's really incumbent upon the like major national journalism foundations that have been in this work for a little bit longer to really, you know, sound the alarm with regional and local partners to say that this really matters for whatever issue area that you're concerned about. And I really want to credit my colleagues, Teresa Gorman and Josh Stearns, who've been doing that in our ecosystem regions pretty much since Democracy Fund was, you know, created.
Great. One of the things I wanted to go back to is the charitable purpose and benefits. So can you define that a little bit more for the audience so they'll understand exactly what that means to them and how they can participate?
So in any instance, it just is going to vary, right? So if you come to Knight Foundation let me just be broad. If you come to any foundation and you're saying, I am an important news organization, I provide news and information, journalism, and these type of forms, this is what I'm hoping to do, right? And it could be, am I funding, and so the question, and you're asking, saying like, I want some funding that's going to help the news organization, that's going to help us build, that's going to help us with technology, that's going to help us maybe hire some journalists, some editors, some reporters. And
Right.
So the thing that we have to think about and brainstorm is, okay, so if that's the thing we're funding, how are we through this funding giving back to the community, giving back to the journalism community? How are we paying it forward? And so you can really just think about, so one example is, say you come to a foundation and you maybe want a couple of reporters, or you want a line of coverage around environment, or you want to build a line of coverage around education. Think about what are the ways in which the journalists could engage with the community, even beyond the sort of way that they should in their normal course of business. Are there things that they can volunteer for? Is it you going to a community center and talking to the community about what you've learned? Is it providing a service to the community? If you're in education funding, is there something that your organization can do and can sponsor for free, right? Because this is a charitable thing that you're doing for the community in that vein of education. So you have to think about, like, how are we paying it forward to the larger public and community with this funds.
If I could just elaborate on that point, I think LaSharah said it really well, but you might also think, like, we're a business, this is the coverage we're providing. If we get the additional support in philanthropy, we might be able to focus coverage on poverty or equity or the environment, particular program areas that correspond to the program interest of the funder, and also justify a philanthropic payment. That's the way a number of foundations have justified it. And so, the poverty coverage, becomes a case that is not just, not that there's anything wrong with sports or cooking or whatever, but like the normal production that you would be having otherwise.
Financial literacy is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's something that I think the African American community is not being taught at home, and it definitely is not being communicated in the schools. So is that some coverage that could actually, is there a grant that we could really apply for that actually talks about equity and inclusion as it relates to financial literacy?
Let's see, why not?
I think it depends on like the foundation or like the organization that you're trying to build a partnership with. Like there's so many different issues that funders are concerned about right now. Like you could go to like a science foundation that's focused on environmental justice and seek a grant to, support a series on what that looks like in the South, right? Or you could go to a foundation that's focused on, LGBTQ issues and seek a grant on how over-policing of like Black trans communities, affects XYZ. So I think there's like a lot of space for a wide breadth of stories. You just really have to hone in on what the story you want to tell is. And I think look for the funder that's already doing that rather than trying to sort of move your sort of reporting around to fit the funder. I know that works sometimes, but I think, if you want to do it the best way for your newsroom, and funders really should be accommodating our grantees as well. I think that's always the best case scenario.
The best advice that I give people I talk to just broadly and generally who want advice about funding is figure out, so your strategic priorities and what you want to do, right? And if you are about to talk to a funder, you need to know what their strategic priorities are and what they want to do. And if it's clear that they're not aligned, then that's not going to be a good fit, right? That's not going to be a good fit for you. That's not going to be a good fit for them, because the worst thing you can do is take money and then have to deliver on something that is not core to your mission, not core to your goals for the year or your 3-year plan, whatever. Like you have to really go into every conversation with a funder well aware of what they're funding, what their goals are. And when you pitch them specifically to that. Mm-hmm. And they're going to know you did your homework. They're going to understand, okay, we are strategically aligned. Let's figure out what we can do together.
Okay. So one of the things, as journalists, we do know how to write to the public, but I think there's a different language, as I understand it, when you're actually writing a grant to a funder. So how do you distinguish, and where do you get the training to understand what you need to tell them and how to tell it? That's one part. And the other thing is, if we have a list of all of the members that we can approach, and I guess that's the way for you to determine what they will fund, how do you approach them as well? Because the fact is, I've understood if you ask a funder for funding, they'll give you advice. But if you ask them for advice, they're more likely to give you funding. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've been told several times. So if you could speak to both of those, that would be great. LaSharah, you want to start?
Sure. So that's really good. I've never heard that. If you ask for advice, goodness. I would say funding is all about building relationships, period. It's all about building relationships. This is not the best metaphor, but it really is accurate in that I tell people to sort of think of funding as you would like dating, right? You're not going to ask to marry somebody on the first date. So in that first conversation, you don't really want to come in asking for $1 million. That's, like you wouldn't ask someone to marry you on the first date, right? And so you want to build a relationship. And in many cases, it might take a couple months for them to understand you, for you to understand them, and to be able to move forward in a really good way. I will say that as a funder, I love those conversations where those initial conversations where there's not a ton of pressure, where we're getting to know each other. where, yes, we all know it's part of the conversation that eventually you want, like, we know that does not need to be said. But let's figure out how we can get to a path, and how we can just learn, more about one another. To the piece about writing, I would just say each foundation is going to be different. I don't like to write in a way that feels like grant writing. I think the best advice I can give is to be very specific. I don't want to see a proposal that's sort of filled with a lot of flowery language. Be specific. When somebody asks what are the grant activities, I'm asking what are the things that we're paying for. When we ask about what's the impact, talk about what you hope that will bring, right? In a very tangible way. The more tangible and down to earth that you can be in the writing, the better.
I think LaSharah has offered some really great advice. I think funders are people too, like they talk just like normal people do. And the funding world is changing all the time too. So the composition of who's a funder, well, you're looking at two of them right here. And, one of the things I do when we used to be able to actually be in a room together, I get a show of hands, and more of the funders I'm seeing are actually former journalists. The downside of a declining field of journalism is that a lot of those people are looking for different lines of work, and a lot of them are ending up in philanthropy. There's actually transferable job skills actually in terms of the kind of investigation you do, the kind of inquiry you do, and then that has been, I think, a really great addition to the field of philanthropy to see a lot more journalism experience. The other thing I want to say is just the relationship piece of it. Of course, everybody's trying to get a date with LaSharah and Leah. Like they're the hottest prospects. Everybody knows the Knight Foundation and the Democracy Fund. But there are people in your neighborhoods, and I really want to stress this. One of the links that we've provided is to a report on community foundations. And community foundations are maybe not as well known to everybody else, but there's one in your community. We did a report last year, and it showed that over a decade, there were over 3,500 grants worth over about $110 million from 140 funders around the country. It's a lot of activity, and the trajectory of that grant making was from 6.5 million in the first year to over 25 million in the last year of that study. So the trajectory is very sharply up. And I think what I would encourage you to say is, like, you may know a program officer at your community foundation, and even more importantly, the person who runs the car dealership who you might have sold an ad to in years gone by. They probably have a donor advised fund at the community foundation. And so really I would encourage people to reorient their thinking about fundraising to what are my relationships in the community? Do they have a private foundation? Or if they're not quite that well off, they might very well have a donor advised fund at the community foundation. And that's where a lot of money is flowing through. And they are not going to have the same kind of complex legal structures. They're going to say, like, hey, donor advisor at the community foundation, can I make this grant? Can you help me do it? So it's really much more of a personal dialogue you have with the car dealer down the block who has done well, and they will make a grant to the local Boys and Girls Club, and they didn't think they could make a grant to you, but you're going to tell them how.
Got it. I understand. So now talk to me about how do we build those relationships, period? How do we get in the door? Is there a letter that you send? Do you call somebody? And do you accept all of these calls? Because that would be the other thing. I mean, how do I get into Cecilia? How do I get into LaSharah? We need to know how we get in to see some of the members that, your members. But I just need to talk a little bit more about that for the group.
Yeah, definitely. Honestly, I feel like that's 40% of my job, just like talking to current grantees, talking to potential grantees, people within our network, connecting us to other organizations and folks in this space. So I'm happy to share my email after this. And I'm also on Twitter if you just want to send me a DM about, work that you've been up to. But I think that's a huge part of philanthropy, right? Just expanding our networks and doing a better job of reaching out. I feel like it's usually incumbent upon potential grantees to do that work, but I think that's a lot of the work that we need to do ourselves too. And part of that is like going to panels like this, right? And getting in front of different groups and different people, new groups and new people who we haven't had the chance to connect with yet. And I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought that we would face some, because one of my big goals before we were all in lockdown was to go to like a slew of different conferences that I hadn't been able to go to, and really meeting new funders and getting them interested in journalism. And at first it seemed like that would really not be possible, but I think meeting in digital and virtual spaces like this has actually made it even more possible to meet new funders. So that's what I would say on my part.
Okay.
Also, just I would say for anybody in your community, don't sell yourself short. That's what you do every day. I mean, more than back when I was a reporter, I would like pick up the phone and call somebody, and those were the days. I mean, I suspect people are still doing that in journalism, and you have the same. Don't be reluctant. You're going to call somebody as a source. Be just as willing to call them. Your private foundations, your community foundations, your major donors in town. I think the trickier part is researching to understand who funds what in your community, and then you already have the personal skills and confidence because of what you do as a publisher to have the confidence of introducing yourself and suggesting the relationship.
Yeah. Use your network. Use your network, like really use it. And in all the ways that Leah and Vince talked about, I just cannot stress that enough. Send the DM, send an email. I will meet with people if after they send an email and I think there's something there, or I'm really just interested, I'll have a call, and it might be in that call that I know this is not going to be a good fit for us, but let me figure out how I can help you. I think I can suggest some people you can talk to, or the other thing that I think is important to know or be part of this conversation is we're largely talking about direct funding, right? And quite honestly, that's important, and that is what's needed, and not enough organizations led by Black people aren't getting direct funding, and that needs to be increased, no doubt. There are other ways to get support and resources in philanthropy, and so part of that is understanding like what are the big. So for Knight, we don't do much direct funding to news organizations, but we're funding intermediaries and we're funding organizations that support larger networks, right? So we gave a lot of money to Report for America, right? Who then in turn have programs that provide free journalists to news organizations. So you can apply, and I encourage you guys to apply for those programs like Report for America that could bring in a journalist into your community, into your news organization for a year. Things like ProPublica's local reporting network, Solutions Journalism, Frontline local reporting network. We just did a grant. So those are all things that I listed that are funded by Knight. So while if you were to apply and get that, you're not necessarily a direct Knight grantee, but you are, right? You're a sub-grantee, you're benefiting from that. And so the really good, smart news organizations know how to leverage those existing programs to help them get to where they want to be as an organization. And those extra resources might help them to get the direct funding because it helps to raise maybe the quality of the journalism that they're doing. It might raise their profile. right? If you're an organization that like, wow, you're a ProPublica news organization in the local network, that's going to get you better publicity than anything, right? And so attaching yourself to these existing programs is key. And then that opens more doors.
Leah, did you want to respond or not? Not Vince has his finger up, so I can go back to him.
Leah.
No, I was just going to say that that's how the majority of our funding works too. And a lot of the organizations that LaSharah listed, Democracy Fund has supported. And I would also include the Center for Cooperative Media out of Montclair, which does a lot of funding for peer-to-peer support and collaborative journalism initiatives.
Okay, all right, Vince, I'm going to go back to you.
The only thing I wanted to say is like, there's some really great advice here on this discussion. I think that it doesn't feel terribly alternative to me. I mean, that is, these are all good ideas for traditional approaches to philanthropy. And just to offer an alternative that is really beyond that is you may find that your financial challenges are such that you're looking for something more dramatic. And I just want to offer an example of a different way of thinking about financing for a news organization. There's an example of some years back, a news outlet called My North News that some of you may be familiar with. It's in North Minneapolis. It's doing really important work right now. Some of the journalists there have won Nnpa awards, so it's in the field. I'm not sure if they're a member per se, but they were, I think, at a moment of financial struggle some years back, and they worked out an arrangement so that they were acquired by Pillsbury United Communities, which is a community organizing it's an old settlement organization from more than, 150 years old or something like that, but they're a really well-established community serving organization that now is running a news organization, My North News. And then those relationships are tricky to sort out, but it can be that it's really important to have the community voice and that the organizations and the funders see that it really is important to adopt and sustain that, but also that, anyway, so they've solved it in an alternative that's really not on the table otherwise, but, there are other paths beyond just philanthropic or earned revenue.
We've got down to the last 3 minutes of this, and I know that we have to have our chair actually close the meeting out. So I want to say if there are any final comments, 1 minute, you can see this, you want to get final comments. If there are any final comments you want to bring that to the table right now, we can keep it pretty short, that would be great. So let's start with you again, LaSharah, please.
I would say, goodness. I would go back to the notion of using your network, right? To connect with in the more traditional way that we've been talking about, but also to tap into what we haven't really talked about is building sort of like an individual donors sort of situation, right? Like, can you build a membership program? Really tap into the community right now, or really many of us are feeling very close to the news organizations that are near and dear to us, and we're looking for ways to support them and give them a path forward, right? Whether it's an organization like a foundation or a high net worth individual, or the person who just lives in the community and wants to give $20 to help create those pathways for people.
Okay, I need to do women. I'm supposed to do something, so I'm not going to be able to get to everybody because I think that we only have a minute left. So I need to bring in our chairperson, Florio Marshall, so he can actually close out.
Plus one to what LaSharah said anyway.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I really do appreciate you for being so open and honest with your conversations today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic panel. I mean, my goodness, LaSharah, Vince, Leah, Janis for moderating. Wonderful information, and you all help us do what we do. I mean, we have been committed for 194 years, and will continue to, fight the good fight, without fear or favor. and make sure that our communities really understand the importance of what we do. I always talk about the newspapers are the police of the politicians. And when you think about that, you say, the police, yes, because there are things that we have to do. We have the time and the ink and the space to really go after those folks that aren't doing right. And while our orange guy that used to be ahead of us would talk about fake news, well, it's not so much fake news, it's called depleted news. We don't have the resources to do what we need to do. And that is just a massive, massive challenge. And, we will come through better on the other side. Luckily, most of us are not heavily in debt as the dailies have been, and we can continue to do what we do. So thank you very much. We definitely do appreciate it. Let me go on to my very, very brief comments. Thank you all for attending Black Press Week 2021. We are here for you. We are glad that you were able to consume a couple days of information and knowledge. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to our honorees. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Hiram Jackson. Thank you, Janis Ware. Thank you, Norman Rich. Norman Rich is the guy that you never see that puts on everything and makes us look wonderful and fantastic. And thank you very much, Norman. A couple other things. Our Nnpa F board, National Newspaper Publishers Association Fund board. Incredible board. We have had a wonderful, wonderful time working for you. Thank you, Sonny, as vice chair. Thank you, Jamie, as treasurer. Thank you, Denise, for all that you do. The secretary is the most underappreciated position on a board. And those of us that have run boards know that without a great secretary, things just do not get done. So thank you very much, Denise. We will begin a capital campaign very shortly because we want to help rebuild our wire service and provide the type of news and information on a local granular level that all of our publishers currently provide. We want to help from a national standpoint to make sure that everybody has what they need and we can continue to report the news because all news is local. With that, I believe I've thanked everyone. I don't think I've missed anybody. Our next event that's coming up is June 24th and 25th, the Nnpa annual conference. It'll be packed with a ton of publishers, sponsors, community leaders. This is what we do every summer to kind of reinvigorate. And yes, it will be virtual. I like to go out on a limb and say that we will not be doing this virtually next year. I think we'll be all vaccinated, herd immunity will have happened, and we'll be able to go ahead and meet in person again and fellowship and do what we need to do. Thank you very much on behalf of the NNPF, the fund. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you in June. Thank you.